You're listening to What to Listen To, the podcast that answers the question you didn't even know you were asking. From fascinating deep dives to thought-provoking trends, we've got your ears covered, so sit back, plug in, and let's explore what's worth your time today.
All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a question that might seem pretty basic at first glance. Why did people come to America?
It does seem like a simple question.
You'd think freedom would be the obvious answer, right?
Ugh.
You know, pursuing happiness, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's usually the go-to answer.
But the sources you sent over, well, they tell a bit of a different story. It's much more complicated than that. And it all ties back to this age-old power struggle between Catholics and Protestants.
It really is. This whole story is about rebellion, royalty, religion, and it all begins way before America even existed.
Okay, hold on. So you're saying to understand America, we got to go back to like pre-America Europe.
Exactly. Picture this. It's Europe, and the Catholic Church is like this massive force. It controls everything. I mean, everything. Politics, taxes, you name it.
Wow.
Yeah, and this was during a time when the whole divine right of kings thing was huge.
Right.
Everyone believed that monarchs got their power straight from God. So if you messed with the king, you were basically messing with God himself.
Basically, don't even think about challenging the king, or you're going to have to answer to someone much higher up. Got it. But then someone did challenge the system.
They did. That's where Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation come in.
Right.
Martin Luther, he was a total game changer. He stood up to the church, called out the corruption, and basically started a movement. And that movement, well, it had a ripple effect all across Europe, eventually making its way across the Atlantic.
And that's where the printing press comes in, right?
Right.
It was like this megaphone for Protestant ideas, spreading them everywhere. Kind of like going viral in the 16th century.
Exactly.
One thing that really struck me while I was reading about this was the whole system of indulgences during the Middle Ages.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of funny when you think about it now, but people could actually pay the church for forgiveness of their sins.
Well, it might seem absurd now, but it was how the church held onto its power and, of course, made a ton of money. But reformers like Luther, they were outraged. They believed you couldn't just buy your way into heaven.
Makes sense. So all this outrage, plus the printing press, spreading these new ideas and people wanting religious freedom, that all led to some pretty big conflicts, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Reformation, it wasn't exactly a peaceful transition. The wars of religion, especially the 30 Years' War, were incredibly brutal. They left Europe scarred, and those scars are still visible today.
To put it in perspective, the 30 Years' War wiped out something like a third of Germany's population. I mean, that's massive.
Yeah, the effects were huge. For instance, the whole religious divide between England and Ireland.
Yeah.
Well, England became Protestant and Ireland stayed Catholic. It all goes back to that time, and it still has an impact on their relationship even now.
It's crazy how events from centuries ago can still have such a strong influence.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got this religious upheaval going on, but you also mentioned royalty. What was it like living under a monarchy back then?
Well, if you were a regular person, life was completely different from how the rulers lived. Yeah. Think Louis XIV, Elizabeth I, they had it all. They lived in insane luxury, surrounded by wealth, while their subjects, the common people, were struggling, stuck in poverty, and paying taxes to both the church and the crown.
Wow. It's hard to imagine a system where such a huge gap between the rich and the poor was just like accepted.
Yeah, it was a system built to keep those in power and control.
Right.
For example, Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles.
Boy, yeah.
It cost billions in today's money. And while he was building that palace, his people were literally starving. It's a pretty powerful example of just how different life was for the rulers compared to everyone else.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark contrast. Yeah. So with all this happening, it's no wonder that Protestants started looking for a way out. And that way out was, of course, America,
right.
A brand new land where they could have the religious freedom they'd been denied without the church and the monarchs controlling everything.
Exactly. America was a chance for them to start fresh, to escape religious persecution, and to build a society based on their own beliefs. But it's important to remember that their idea of freedom, well, it wasn't always so inclusive.
Wait, hold on. Didn't they come to America specifically for religious freedom?
They did, but their version of religious freedom often only applied to them. I mean, they wanted to escape persecution, but they sometimes ended up persecuting others who didn't believe exactly like they did.
So they escaped one kind of religious oppression just to create another. That's Well, that's pretty ironic.
Yeah, it's complicated. Early American history, it's full of contradictions. A good example is Maryland. It was originally founded as a safe place for Catholics, but then later they made laws that didn't allow Catholics to vote. It just shows how hard it is to put ideals into practice.
Yeah, it shows you how tricky it can be to actually build a society where everyone's truly included. And those contradictions, well, they become even more obvious when you look at another big part of that us versus them story in early America. I'm talking about slavery. Right, slavery. It's kind of the elephant in the room. How could a nation built on freedom and equality just ignore something so awful?
To really understand that paradox, we need to rewind a bit, go back to the very beginning of the colonies. Before enslaved Africans became the main source of labor, there was this other system in place. It was called indentured servitude.
Indentured servitude. Okay.
Yeah.
So was that like a trial run for slavery?
I wouldn't say a trial run exactly, but it definitely laid the groundwork. Back in the 17th century, you had all these wealthy landowners, and they needed people to work their land. I mean, especially those massive tobacco plantations.
Right.
So they offered poor Europeans this deal. They'd pay for their passage to America, and in exchange, these people would work for them for a certain number of years.
So it's kind of like a work for passage kind of thing?
Exactly.
I guess if you were desperate enough, it might have seemed like a decent option back then.
Yeah, it might have seemed okay on paper, but in reality, it was often really brutal. Indentured servants had to do super hard labor. They didn't get enough food, and sometimes they were even physically abused.
Seriously?
Yeah, and a lot of them, they didn't even live long enough to finish their contracts.
Wait, so they were basically working people to death. That's terrible.
It was a rough system. I mean, even England had to step in. They passed laws to try and make things a little better for indentured servants. They even put limits on, how much they could be whipped.
Wow. That's a chilling thought. But how did things shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery?
Yeah.
Where people were seen as property with no chance of ever being free.
Well, there were a few different things that led to that horrible change. For one thing, European indentured servants could blend in easier, which meant they could run away and disappear. That was a big problem for landowners.
Yeah, I can see how that would be an issue.
And then, once they finished their contracts, these servants were supposed to get some land, but that created competition for resources. So landowners needed a workforce that was more permanent, more under their control, and that's where enslaved Africans came in.
So basically, they switched to a system that treated people like objects, all because of these logistical issues and this need for more control.
Sadly, yeah. Enslaved Africans were seen as different, as other, and that made it easier to justify treating them so inhumanely. Their perceived difference was used to create this hierarchy, a stark divide between us and them.
But there must have been some pushback, right? Some people who saw how morally wrong this all was.
Oh, there definitely was some resistance, both from enslaved Africans themselves and from some white colonists who recognized that slavery was just plain wrong.
I bet that resistance took a lot of different forms. Were there actual slave revolts?
Absolutely. And those revolts were a big part of what led to the Civil War. One of the most famous ones was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina back in 1739. Enslaved Africans, they got their hands on some weapons, and they started marching towards Spanish Florida.
Spanish Florida?
Yeah, it was known as a place where escaped slaves could find refuge.
Oh, I see.
So they were fighting for their lives, for their freedom. They were willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life.
That's incredible.
The rebellion was eventually put down, but it had a huge impact on the South. It made slave owners even more afraid of uprisings, and it really reinforced that whole us versus them mentality.
It must have been terrifying for them, knowing that the people they were enslaving could fight back like that.
The fear was definitely real, and it only got worse after the Haitian Revolution in the late 1700s.
The Haitian Revolution.
Yeah. Enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, they rose up and overthrew their colonial masters. They ended up creating the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere.
Wow. I don't know much about that. But it sounds like a really important moment in history.
It was. And it had this huge impact throughout the Americas. It showed that enslaved people could not only resist, but actually win their freedom. It gave hope to those who were enslaved, and it was a nightmare for those who profited from slavery.
It must have really shaken things up. It challenged the entire system of slavery, the whole idea behind it.
Exactly. And slaveholders in America, they started to get really worried about similar uprisings happening here. It added to that us versus them narrative, pushing the North and South further apart.
So it wasn't just the moral arguments against slavery. It was also the fear of rebellion that was driving the tension.
Exactly. And on top of all that, the North and South were becoming more and more different economically. The South's economy was all about agriculture, especially crops like cotton and tobacco.
Which meant they needed enslaved labor to make money.
Right. But the North was becoming more industrialized, they were using paid labor, and that led to a lot of resentment towards the South's system of unpaid labor.
So you've got this us versus them thing happening on all these different levels, morally, economically, socially.
Exactly. They were basically working with two completely different economic systems, and those systems were on a collision course.
It sounds like a powder keg, just waiting to explode. Moral outrage, economic anxiety, fear. That's a dangerous mix.
It was. And every time a new state joined the Union, the balance of power between slave and free states shifted, making things even more volatile. The whole nation was on edge, and the question of slavery was at the center of it all.
So things were like heading towards a major showdown. And that showdown happened with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
Exactly. Now, when Lincoln was elected, he wasn't an abolitionist. His goal was to stop slavery from spreading.
But his election was enough to push the South over the edge.
Oh, yeah. The South saw Lincoln's election as a direct attack on their way of life, on their economy, on their identity. They were afraid of losing their power in the Union.
So they decided to secede, to create their own country where slavery would be protected.
Exactly. And in April of 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That was the start of the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history.
A war fought over the very soul of the nation. A war fueled by this deep-seated us versus them way of thinking.
It's a dark and tragic part of our history, but it's a part we have to learn from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've gone from religious rebellion in Europe to the horrors of slavery and the eruption of the Civil War. And all of this was driven by different versions of that us versus them narrative. It's been a whirlwind of history, that's for sure.
Yeah, it really is amazing how that whole us versus them idea has been a part of so much of American history, from the religious stuff we talked about to slavery to a whole nation divided against itself. It seems like that theme just keeps popping up over and over.
It does, doesn't it? And it doesn't just end with the Civil War. I mean, getting rid of slavery was a huge victory, but it didn't magically erase all the prejudice and inequality that had been ingrained in America for centuries. So even after the war, even after slavery was abolished, people were still stuck in that us versus them mindset. What about Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War? I thought that was supposed to be about rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people into society.
It was. Reconstruction had some really good goals, but there was so much resistance, and a lot of the promises of equality they weren't kept. The end of slavery was a new beginning in a lot of ways, but the fight for true equality, that was far from over.
Man, that's tough to hear. It's like we took this huge step forward and then just went right back to the same old ways. So what happened after that? Did that us versus them mentality finally fade away?
Well, not exactly. The fight for civil rights went on, and eventually it led to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, they became leaders in the fight against segregation and discrimination. They pushed for voting rights and equal opportunities for Black Americans.
The civil rights movement, that was a turning point in our history, wasn't it? A time when the fight for equality was front and center.
It was. It showed just how brave and determined people were. They refused to accept the way things were. They challenged that whole us versus them narrative that had been used to justify discrimination for so long.
But this wasn't only about Black Americans, was it? Weren't there other groups who were also facing discrimination and exclusion at that time?
Oh, absolutely. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, America had all these waves of immigration.
Right.
And with each new wave came a new group of people to be prejudiced against.
It's like every generation had to find its own other to be afraid of and exclude.
Yeah, it's a sad pattern, but it keeps repeating. We saw it with the Irish in the 1800s, then with the Chinese, who helped build the railroads, and later with immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Each group faced their own challenges, their own version of us versus them.
It wasn't just about race or ethnicity either, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. People were divided by their religion, their political beliefs, their cultural differences, anything that could be used to make someone seem like an outsider, like they didn't belong.
It's almost like we're programmed to focus on the things that make us different and use those differences to be scared of each other or exclude each other. It's kind of depressing, honestly. Do you think this us versus them thing is still happening in America today?
I think it's still there for sure. It might look different now, but it's still there. Just look at how divided the country is politically. Or think about those echo chambers online where everyone just hears the same opinions over and over. We're constantly being told who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we're more divided than ever these days. Is there any way to bridge those divides, to move past this us versus them way of thinking?
I think there's always hope. But it takes work. We have to be willing to actually listen to each other, to judge less, and to try to understand where people who are different from us are coming from. It's about remembering that we're all human and working together to create a society where everyone feels like they belong.
That's easier said than done, I think. But it's something worth aiming for.
It is. It's a challenge we have to face if we want to build a better future for everyone.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground today. From the very beginnings of America, through the Civil War, through immigration and the fight for civil rights, all the way to the present day. It's amazing to see how this whole us versus them idea has been such a constant throughout our history.
It has. It's a story that's still being written.
And to our listener, the next time you meet someone who seems different from you, remember this conversation. Remember all the complicated history we talked about. And maybe, just maybe, you can help write a new chapter in that story. A chapter where those lines that divide us start to disappear, and we start seeing each other not as them, but as us.
Thanks for tuning in to What to Listen To. If we sparked your curiosity, leave us a review, share the episode, or just keep the conversation going. Until next time, don't just hear the world, listen to it.